On June 18, 2013, reports emerged about a tragic car accident that resulted in the untimely demise of Michael Hastings, a 33-year-old American journalist and author. Rumours and speculation regarding a potential conspiracy theory and subsequent cover-up began to circulate. The reason behind this conjecture stems from Michael Hastings' reputable career, particularly his notable and critical coverage of the Iraq War for Newsweek magazine during the early 2000s. Earning significant acclaim, his 2010 article titled The Runaway General, published in Rolling Stone magazine, garnered widespread attention. This article shed light on the disapproval of General Stanley McChrystal and his team towards civilian government officials, including then Vice President Joe Biden and several other prominent figures of the Obama administration. Inevitably, the publication of the article led to the resignation of the highly respected General McChrystal, who before the then President Obama put him in charge of the war in Afghanistan, had spent 5 years running the Pentagon's most secretive black ops.
Today I accepted General Stanley McChrystal's resignation as commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. I did so with considerable regret. Indeed, it saddens me to lose the service of a soldier who I've come to respect and admire.
Continuing his career's upward trajectory, Michael Hastings garnered even more public and government attention through his outspoken criticism of the Obama administration's Department of Justice investigation targeting political reporters in 2013. Hastings and other journalistic figures voiced concern about the measures which were taking place.
Some of our longtime trusted sources have become nervous and anxious about talking to us, even on stories that aren't about national security. Government employees that we once checked in with regularly will no longer speak to us by phone, and some are reluctant to meet in person. Now, the government may love this. I suspect they do. But beware the government that loves secrecy too much.
Vocal in his condemnation, Hastings labelled the imposed restrictions and the subpoenaing of phone records from the Associated Press as the ominous inception of an assault on free journalism.
The Obama administration has clearly declared war on the press. It's declared war on investigative journalists, our sources. I think the only recourse to this kind of behavior by the government is to say back to the government, we declare war on you, and from this point forward, we should no longer, as a media as a whole, cooperate in any manner with the government in terms of when we're doing national security stories.
On June 7th, 2013, BuzzFeed published what would ultimately become Michael Hastings' final piece, an article provocatively titled, "Why Democrats Love to Spy on Americans." The article delved into an intense discussion and critique of the Democratic Party and their involvement in what he described as a burgeoning surveillance state. At certain junctures, Hastings even likened the methods employed by the White House to those reminiscent of North Korea. The article elicited considerable attention and scrutiny, adding to the significance of Hastings' already impactful journalistic legacy. In the days leading up to his untimely death, Michael Hastings reportedly had an ongoing investigation into the CIA Director John Brennan as part of a new story he was working on. Hours before he passed away the following morning, the award-winning journalist sent emails to various colleagues, letting them know that his close friends and associates were being interviewed by the FBI, perhaps to give his friends a heads up that they may also be interviewed. He then expressed his intention to temporarily go off radar. This revelation understandably adds to the sense of suspicion surrounding the tragic event. Could this pursuit of a new exposé have been the driving force behind an assassination plot? Many find this scenario highly plausible. Adding to the intrigue, WikiLeaks further fueled speculations when they disclosed that Hastings had contacted their lawyer mere hours before the fatal crash, informing her of an FBI investigation into his activities. However, the FBI later refuted this assertion, causing some uncertainty about the true circumstances surrounding the journalist's demise. But I think it's fair to say that now we've got to a point where even if that statement was true, there will always be doubt. A mere 11 days after the publication of the thought-provoking BuzzFeed article, Michael Hastings tragically lost his life in that fateful car crash. The incident occurred at 4:20 a.m. in a Los Angeles neighborhood. One witness described the car as moving fast, leaving a trail of questions and curiosity in its wake. Why was he driving so fast? Was he trying to get away from someone? News articles described the crash as being intense, due to the fact that the car's engine and transmission were found 100 feet away from the main wreckage. Although the official ruling labelled the incident as an accident, Richard A. Clarke, a national security expert and former government official, introduced an alternative perspective. He proposed the possibility that Michael Hastings' car might have been subject to hacking, thereby, although not explicitly, raising questions about the authenticity of the accident narrative by stating, "It's relatively easy to hack your way into the control system of a car and do such things as cause acceleration when the driver doesn't want acceleration. You can do some really highly destructive things now through hacking a car, and it's not that hard." However, he also added that he was not suggesting that there actually was a hack in this particular incident. Looking further into the feasibility of car hacking, we found this old news report.
Two professional hackers armed with only laptops and an internet connection remotely broke into the internal system of this 2014 Jeep Cherokee. They took control of the Jeep's locks, the steering, the speedometer, even disabled the brakes.
And to make things a little stranger and more suspicious, we found reports that at 12:30 a.m. on the morning he died, Hastings had apparently asked his neighbour and friend, Jordana Thigpen, for use of her car, as he had some concern that his own car had been tampered with, to which she had to decline, as her own car was having mechanical issues. Another worrying detail that she added was that he was scared and he wanted to leave town. The next she heard of him was the news that he had died. A video of the morbidly spectacular fire engulfing the Mercedes-Benz C250 coupe further fueled the speculation of sabotage, suggesting that an incendiary device may have played a role in the cause of the crash and the fire that followed. Other reports detailing the incident shed light on Michael Hastings' personal struggles, disclosing that he seemed to be experiencing a setback following a commendable 14-year period of sobriety from substance abuse. Simultaneously, he grappled with renewed episodes of paranoia. Interestingly, accounts from his earlier years suggest that he had informally been recognized as having bipolar disorder during his teenage years. Could these disclosures have just been an attempt to smear his character, to make it seem more likely that he himself was solely responsible for the crash? If you look back in almost anyone's past, it could be possible to find something that might change your opinion of them in the present day. 14 years is a long time ago, and Michael had come a long way since then. And as for his renewed sense of paranoia, perhaps this feeling was more than justified. The autopsy conducted after his tragic passing unveiled the presence of both marijuana and amphetamine in his system at the time of the crash. However, the report notably underscores that these substances were deemed unlikely to have played a role in causing the accident. Alarmingly though, the body was cremated immediately after the autopsy, and we say alarming because this was not authorized by his family.
Meaning he was cremated, and it wasn't the request of the family that went forward and asked for something like that. In fact, the family wanted Michael's body to go home. It's shocking for a couple of reasons. If there was any evidence in his, body at the time of death,
drugs,
anything, that's gone. That evidence is now all gone.
His widow, Elise Jordan, believes that the way he met his end was truly a tragic accident, saying in a TV interview with CNN,
Right now, the LAPD still has an active investigation. I don't really have anything to add. My gut here is that it was just a really tragic accident, and I'm very unlucky, and the world was very unlucky.
While those who are intimately connected to Michael Hastings seem like they've put their faith in the officially declared account of events, it's inevitable that there will persist those people who struggle to embrace such conclusions, especially in cases like this, where the circumstances surrounding the event, as well as the information available, all seem to suggest something far more sinister than a mere accident. What do you think? On June 18, 1977, Charles Morgan's body was found near his car on a desert road in Tucson, Arizona, about 40 miles west of his family home. At the time his body had been discovered, authorities estimated that his life had ended roughly 12 hours earlier, with a single bullet fired at close range to the back of his head. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, a gun holster, and carrying a concealed knife. It would seem Charles had come prepared for a confrontation. There was also a supply of ammunition found inside his car, as well as other weapons and sets of handcuffs. Was he planning on detaining someone? Rather strangely, one of his own teeth was found wrapped up in a tissue in his car, as well as a pair of sunglasses, which were later determined to belong to someone else. Another strange detail discovered by local investigators was that his car had been modified so that it could be unlocked from the fender. Why would such a modification be made? Also, there was a map with directions of how to get to the location his murder took place, which may indicate that this area wasn't familiar to him. Another strange piece of evidence which was discovered was a $2 bill which was pinned to his underwear. What made this $2 bill even stranger was that it had 7 Spanish names listed beginning with the letters A through G, as well as a Bible citation which said Ecclesiastes 12, with arrows pointing at the 1 and 8 on the serial number. On the back of the bill, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were each numbered 1 through 7. Furthermore, there was a rough map of some roads that led between Tucson and the Mexican border, leading to a place called Robles Junction and a town called Sasabe, an area that investigators believe was likely involved in smuggling, as the area had a small farm which also had a few aeroplane landing strips. Later examinations established that Morgan had been shot with his own .357 Magnum, which was found next to him, but no fingerprints at all could be found on the gun. At this point, you might ask yourself, who was Chuck Morgan, and why had this happened to him? How did he come to end up like this, with all those bizarre details and puzzling pieces of evidence? Would you find it hard to believe that it was concluded that Chuck took his own life? If so, you're not the only one. Sit back and get ready to hear all about one of the USA's most cryptic cases, one which many still believe is unsolved and unexplained. With all the evidence gathered at the scene, you may have thought that 39-year-old Charles Morgan, or Chuck as he liked to be called, was probably some kind of experienced or hardened criminal gang member. However, that really wasn't the case. Chuck was a family man with a wife and 4 daughters. He also had a successful business and escrow agency in Tucson, Arizona, of which he was the president. So on the surface, he was not really the typical criminal type. Well, at least not the type that turns up to off-road meetings with a gun, knife and bulletproof vest anyway. But as we all know, looks can be deceiving. On the morning of March 22nd, Chuck drove the 2 youngest of his 4 daughters to school before heading to work like any other ordinary day. However, after dropping the 2 girls off, Chuck simply vanished, leaving his family puzzled and worried about what could have possibly happened to him. On March 25th, 3 long days after he went missing, Chuck came back home limping and in a rather terrible state. His wife Ruth recalls Chuck was missing a shoe, had a set of plastic handcuffs wrapped around one of his ankles, and his hands were bound together with a plastic zip tie. He was pointing at his throat, indicating he was unable to speak, so he wrote down on a piece of paper that he had been kidnapped and tortured. He also explained that he had a hallucinogenic drug poured down his throat, and if he ingested it fully, his nervous system would have totally been destroyed, causing either his immediate death or irreversible insanity. Chuck refused to reveal who had abducted and tortured him, and simply wrote down instructions for Ruth to move his car from outside, as he didn't want them to know that he had come home. He also didn't want to reveal who they were. Ruth moved the car, then came back inside and went to go and call the police, but Chuck stopped her immediately and wrote down, "If you call the cops, they'll kill all of us, even the girls." Morgan unveiled the secret behind a seemingly ordinary life and confessed to his wife that he was an undercover agent working for the federal government, specifically for the Treasury Department, which is the department responsible for maintaining systems that are critical to the nation's financial infrastructure. Chuck claimed that he had been helping them fight organised crime, with a focus on money laundering in particular. He told Ruth that the unidentified people who had captured him had taken his Treasury ID. What they planned to do with it exactly wasn't so clear. He also told Ruth that he was aware that a lot of laundering was taking place in the town, but added he was not involved in it himself. For the following week, Ruth nursed her husband by feeding him with an eyedropper, but although he physically recovered from this dreadful experience, and his voice returned, he just wasn't the same. He was still a mental wreck, and understandably very paranoid. Chuck turned into a tormented soul and started wearing a bulletproof vest every day in fear for his life. He also feared for the safety of his daughters, and insisted that he drove them to and from school, and informed them that nobody other than himself was authorized to collect them from the school. 2 months of what seemed like relative normality went by, and just when it seemed that the Morgan family could finally leave that dreadful episode behind them, things took a dramatic turn for the worse. On June 7th, Chuck disappeared again while on his way to work after visiting his parents early one morning. That was the last morning that any of his loved ones saw him again. He had gone to his parents' home specifically to speak to his father. He told him that if anything happens to him, there was a letter hidden in the house that would explain everything. He told his father not to tell Ruth about the letter, at least, not while he was still alive anyway, as he believed the less she knew, the safer she would be. 9 days after Chuck had gone missing, his wife received a phone call from a mysterious woman who said, "Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. The most interesting part of those verses reads, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." I'm no theologian, but this sounds very much like a reference to facing something bad or some kind of danger, but having faith in God that all will be well in the long run. But it definitely has a more hidden significance here. But what is it? Did the caller assume that Ruth would know? We'd be interested to hear your thoughts. It's obviously not just a coincidence that there are 7 Spanish names listed, and then 7 signers of the Declaration of Independence. The real question now is how the 2 sets of names relate to each other, and then how both relate to Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1-8. 2 days after receiving that cryptic message, Chuck's body was found. Did the caller assume Chuck really was going to be okay? If not, why make the phone call at all? Just to give his wife peace of mind, perhaps, if only for a short time. Charles Morgan's death was officially ruled to have been from a self-inflicted gun wound, but his wife refused to believe that he would be capable of doing such a thing. She simply believes that he wouldn't want to leave his family behind, least of all without writing a letter to each of them. So what really happened to him? How would he possibly shoot himself in the back of the head? People who do sadly make this kind of decision for themselves don't typically aim the gun here. Also, it seems rather bizarre that he would get kitted out with a bulletproof vest, only to go and do something like that. In an episode of the old TV series Unsolved Mysteries, investigator and journalist Don Devereaux, who was looking into the suspicious death of Charles, justly stated, "It is not a very normal place to shoot oneself. I've never seen in all my years as a journalist a fellow taking himself out in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shooting himself in the back of the head." Did Chuck really decide to end his own life, leaving behind a trail of mysterious clues while being a potential witness in fraud and laundering cases? There are so many peculiar details that emerged during the investigation and also during our research. One being the fact that Morgan was right-handed, but gun residue was found on his left hand. The fact that the gun residue was found on his hand is probably the reason why investigators leaned towards the idea that he shot himself. But isn't it possible he had fired the gun at someone beforehand? The fact that there were no fingerprints on his gun should surely end the theory that he did this to himself, since if he shot himself, he wouldn't have been able to wipe the fingerprints off the gun, would he? Chuck was clearly trying to protect himself with the vest, the knife, the gun, etc. So why would he end himself then? Also, some of the evidence found at the scene points towards someone else being present when Chuck died. More specifically, the sunglasses. Who did they belong to? How was it determined that they didn't belong to him? They could easily be dismissed as belonging to a friend who left them there, but nobody came forward to claim them. Another interesting fact is that Arizona is the only state that allowed blind trust ownership of real estate. According to this law, people could buy a property without being traced. Therefore, an escrow agent, such as Morgan, was the only person who knew an owner's identity in cases like this. At the time of his disappearance, Morgan was apparently doing escrow work for two alleged organised crime groups, the Ned Warren family and the Joe Bonanno family. Could it be possible that the mob got rid of him as he could reveal their identity and whereabouts? Maybe, but the mafia is not known historically to use drugs or hallucinogens for its hits, or torture for that matter. They would just break bones or kill the person to send a direct and clear message to everyone. Also, why would they phone his wife and leave a Bible reference? Interestingly, one organisation that has a history with hallucinogens is the CIA. Was it a cover story, just like the more recent mysterious death of MI6 agent Gareth Williams in 2010? Perhaps Morgan may have found out something someone didn't want him to know, so they had him killed and then bribed or threatened the police. When Unsolved Mysteries covered the case in the 90s, Lieutenant Curtis of the Prima County Sheriff's Department gave an interview which may support this theory. He said he knew Sheriff's Department intelligence officers who were working the case at the time. They thought the case really was a homicide and gang-related. He added that the individuals who he spoke to eventually left the department because of what they detected in this case and other cases combined, and that those same officers were in fear for their lives and eventually left law enforcement. Two of these individuals apparently even left the country. What about the unidentified woman who called Ruth 2 days before he was found? A few days after Morgan's death, the woman came forward and made herself known to police as Green Eyes. She told them that she had known Morgan and that she had seen him after he disappeared during the 9 days before his death. According to Green Eyes, Morgan showed her a briefcase with a lot of money in it, saying that he was going to use that money to buy off a hitman who had been hired to murder him. Morgan had told Green Eyes that in the briefcase there was a $90,000 contract out on his life that was escalating at the rate of $5,000 per day. Also, what happened to the letter Chuck had hidden in the house? Well, apparently, that letter has never been found, so we have no idea what information Chuck left behind, or if there ever was a letter at all. However, not long after Chuck's death, 2 men claiming to be FBI agents went to visit the Morgan family's home and abruptly turned the house upside down, searching for something, without giving any explanations to his wife, who felt extremely intimidated during the entire ordeal. Did those FBI agents find the letter and take it away, as it contained some information which was not to be disclosed? Perhaps the letter contained some sort of evidence that could have brought down some powerful people. Reporter Don Devereaux was on a mission to find out the truth, and one day he made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI regarding Morgan's case. And this is where another bizarre turn came. The FBI claimed that they had never even heard of Charles Morgan, and there was no file on him at all. Nevertheless, they opened an investigation and searched his house, and even interviewed Morgan's attorney. How do you explain that? Who were those men who had searched the house before? And who were they working for? Perhaps Chuck really was indeed an undercover federal agent working against the mob. Or was he working for them? Did the authorities help to cover up his mysterious death? Who was Green Eyes? A secret woman in his life? Or a fellow agent? Or just someone with connections to organized crime? What was that Bible passage meant to indicate? And what about all the other strange details? The tooth? The $2 bill? While the death of Charles Morgan may have been officially deemed to have been from a self-inflicted gun wound to the head, many people, understandably, think this case reached the wrong conclusion. Following the episode of Unsolved Mysteries, over 600 calls came into their call centre. Don Devereaux investigated every one of them. Between 1973 and when he was killed in 1977, Morgan was allegedly heavily involved in money laundering and doing large transactions in gold and platinum. And by large, we're talking amounts in excess of $1 billion a year in gold alone, the source of which was apparently Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. Murkier details came in, suggesting the involvement of either corrupt or undercover individuals from the US intelligence community. Some of the tips also mentioned involvement of Vietnamese government officials who were going into exile. The calls also led Devereaux to discover what was perhaps the trigger behind his elimination. Charles had apparently kept a set of duplicate records of all the dodgy dealings. While Morgan seemed to think that the duplicates would be some kind of protection, it proved to be that he had unintentionally sealed his own doom. To the criminals he was working for, it probably made him seem like an untrustworthy risk, and that was a risk none of those shady individuals wanted to take. For Don Devereaux, and anyone else familiar with the case, all this new alleged information clearly pointed out that Charles Morgan met his demise because he knew too much. Just as the story seems like it's taken as many twists as it could, more would emerge, 13 years after the death of Chuck Morgan. At around midnight on May 14th, 1990, 35-year-old Doug Johnston was found dead in his car in his computer graphics company car park. He had suffered a single gun wound behind his left ear from a distance estimated to have been at least 12 inches. At first, local authorities believed Doug turned the gun on himself. However, he was right-handed, there was no powder residue on his hands, and there was no gun found at the scene. Johnston's family and friends also could not and did not believe that Doug could have taken his own life. He had just completed a computer-aided drafting course and had graduated with honours and had even secured a job. Everything was going well for him. What's really interesting, and where the possible connection comes from, is that Johnston had a similar-looking house and drove a similar car to the crime journalist Don Devereaux, who lived across the street from the car park where Doug was killed. As a result, Devereaux took interest in the investigation and began to follow it, but eventually lost track of it over the course of the year. During the year after the death of Doug Johnston, Devereaux was contacted by Washington-based writer Dan Casolaro, who had requested he share some of his findings in relation to Morgan's death and dealings prior to it. Don agreed to do so. However, Dan Cossolaro was found dead in a hotel room just before he could receive the information. Interestingly, according to Cossolaro's brother, Dan was afraid of blood, and it would seem unlikely then that he would choose to end his life by inflicting a deep wound to his own wrists, as medical examiners had determined he did so. Furthermore, to add extra doubt, as if you even needed it, Dan's brother was a doctor, and he said that in the past Dan was reluctant to even allow him to prick his finger to take the smallest of blood samples. Many believe that Doug was killed after he was mistaken for Devereaux, and that Devereaux was targeted for his investigation in Charles's case, and this was somewhat confirmed 6 months after Dan Cossolaro's death. In a phone call from one of his journalist connections, Devereaux was told that he was in fact the intended target that night. This information being relayed to him came from what was apparently a reliable source in the CIA. The caller also informed Devereaux that there have been, and there still are, contracts out to kill you. He also went on to suggest that this was due to his work supposedly being a threat to not just the mob in Phoenix, but also the CIA. Could it be that the CIA needed to silence him in order to keep him from interrupting their own investigations? Or were those particular agents rogue, and just as dirty as the mob? Well, things got even stranger when later 2 more sources, another from the CIA and one from Israeli intelligence, confirmed the death threats. What had Devereaux really found? It sounds like he was onto something bigger than he ever realized, and that Doug Johnston was very likely the innocent victim of a contract hit meant for Devereaux due to his work, which started with the mysterious death of Charles Morgan. The setting for our next case is Silver Plume, Colorado, a small town nestled cozily in the lap of America's Rocky Mountains. Back in 1987, the population was around 130, and one of those residents was a man by the name of Tom Young, an Army Special Forces veteran and retired teacher. Tom had lived in the tiny town for almost 2 decades and ran the local bookshop. On the 7th of September 1987, Tom closed up his shop at the end of the day, and along with his dog Gus, disappeared without a trace. The following year, in the summer of 1988, there was a new guy in town. 48-year-old Keith Raynard was a Chicago-based sports writer for the Daily Herald newspaper. Keith had decided to spend 3 months in Silver Plume, with a view to settling there permanently with his wife if things went well. Keith was to run an antiques shop as his main source of income, which he hoped would do well with the summer tourists and the through traffic the town always had. Living far away from the suburbs and running his own business had always been a dream for Keith, and since he was approaching 50 years old, he decided now was the time to give it a go. His fitness needed improving, and he had a fear of heights too. What better place to fix these issues than the dizzying trails of the Rocky Mountains? He also had another item on his bucket list. Keith had always wanted to write a novel, and the solitude this break from suburbia would provide was the perfect opportunity to make this dream a reality. So, encouraged by his childhood friend Ted Parker, in the June of 1988, Keith found himself in his very own antiques shop, situated on Main Street, in the little old town of Silver Plume. A couple of weeks went by. Keith did odd bits of writing and poetry, but he hadn't made much progress with his novel. His childhood friend Ted owned the cafe next door. The boys had grown up across the street from each other and had been lifelong friends. Through visiting the cafe and chatting to various people, Keith learned the story of the strange disappearance of Tom Young the previous year. Tom had told people that he was planning a trip to Europe, so it was several weeks before the alarm was raised and anybody realized he was actually missing. It turns out Tom's vehicle hadn't left Silver Plume, and his dog Gus wasn't booked into the kennels he usually would be if Tom was out of town. Furthermore, his mother told investigators that he had never told her about any trips to Europe. Among all the things he learned about the strange disappearance, Keith also discovered that the shop he was now occupying used to be Tom's bookshop. He soon became obsessed with the story and the mystery surrounding Tom's disappearance, finally deciding it would be the perfect basis for his novel. A character he named Guy Gypsum became the protagonist of the story, and was basically a mixture of Tom Young and himself. Keith spent a lot of time writing, and soon began to blur the lines between reality and fiction. His daughters said that he liked to immerse himself in his stories and experience what his characters felt. You might say it was a kind of writer's version of method acting. Almost 2 months went by, when, on July 31st, 1988, 2 men hunting on the nearby Republican Mountain discovered both human and canine remains, which was soon identified by police as Tom Young and his dog Gus. The gaping holes found in their skulls made it clear that they had each died from a single shot to the head. A gun was found at the scene, and further investigation revealed that Tom had purchased a firearm only 4 days before he vanished from Silver Plume. Tom's case was closed. The coroner's office and the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department ruled that Tom had first taken the life of his beloved dog Gus, before turning the gun on himself. A week later, on August 7th, Keith Reinhardt closed his antiques shop early at around 2:30 p.m. He then walked around Silver Plume and told several people that he was planning to climb nearby Pendleton Mountain. Most people didn't believe him, knowing that he had a fear of heights and did not like climbing alone. It was late afternoon when he stopped by his friend Ted's cafe and told him his plans, and declared that he was going to reach the top of the mountain. Keith said that if he didn't return, Ted should call on the rescue. He then said goodbye and left, but Ted did not take him seriously. Keith was last seen walking towards Pendleton Mountain, sometime between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Far too late to start a hard hike that would normally take 6 hours. He was dressed in casual clothes, wearing a flannel shirt, blue jeans and tennis shoes, with no rucksack, supplies, or a single piece of equipment. He did not return that night, and the next day, helicopters were sent to search Pendleton Mountain. Colorado's Alpine Rescue Team launched a massive search and rescue mission, and over 200 volunteers scoured the mountain for 7 days. During this time, a Civil Air Patrol plane crashed into the mountain while searching for Keith, seriously injuring the spotter, Don Drobny, and tragically killing the pilot, Terry Leedens. Despite everyone's best efforts and what turned out to be the largest search and rescue mission in Colorado's history, no trace of Keith could be found, nor any clues or evidence to provide a clearer picture of what may have happened to the would-be author. A search of his property revealed a newspaper next to Keith's computer with the headline, "Tom Young's Body Found." Hauntingly, the computer still showed Keith's unfinished book on the screen, and the final paragraph read, "Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt." He understood Tom now and his motivation. Guy closed the door, then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. Many people believe that Keith did exactly that. He went out to the mountain wilderness for exactly the same reason Tom did. But Keith's wife Carolyn was adamant that her husband was not capable of such a thing. She said he was such an upbeat and positive person, and always promoted a positive mental attitude. He had too many friends and family members and too much to live for. Another theory is that Keith staged everything so he could disappear and start a new life, that he was having a midlife crisis and wanted to run away and start with a clean slate. Other than circumstantial speculation, the only other supporting detail is that Keith had allegedly been talking to an unknown woman at a party the night before he went missing. However, according to a family friend, this woman was eventually found and questioned about Keith, but she had no further information. The most out there theory we came across is one that links the disappearances of Tom and Keith to their building, the bookshop and antiques shop they both worked in. While researching the topic, I have to say it reminded me very much of The Shining, the movie and book by Stephen King, where fictional writer Jack Torrance is slowly driven insane by a creepy building, which happens to be set in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado too. That being said, as one online commenter suggested, it's far more likely that an environmental factor, like carbon monoxide or some other kind of low-level toxic exposure over the course of weeks, would be responsible rather than a paranormal explanation. Many people close to the case, including friends and family, believe Keith and Tom were murdered.
But some have doubts.
I think my dad stumbled across something and he just knew too much.
It's unclear if the building had any connection with this, or if it was just a coincidence, but 3 pieces of information add merit to the murder theory. The first is the fact that Tom Young's gun was so badly corroded, investigators could not ballistically match the bullets in the gun found at the scene. The second piece of information is that allegedly, bits of an old green tarpaulin sheet were found on or near Tom's remains, suggesting they may have been hidden from sight by a third party. And finally, an article in the Chicago Sun-Times 10 years later, in August of 1998, mentions the allegations of a California-based journalist who alleges that they uncovered evidence that a major multinational defense contractor had been illegally dumping plutonium in the abandoned Colorado silver mines. If this was in fact the case, then perhaps Tom had discovered the plot and was taken care of before he exposed the perpetrators. Or had he accidentally stumbled into them while out walking with Gus? Then perhaps the following year, through Keith's inquisitive nature and deep research into Tom Young's disappearance, perhaps he had uncovered the truth, or was at least too close for comfort, and had to be eliminated too. Or is this just more dubious speculation? What are your thoughts? On July 14th, 1990, during a seemingly ordinary day in Gulf Breeze, Florida, a highway patrol officer made what he thought was going to be a typical traffic stop after he noticed a broken rear light on a minivan. As the officer came to a stop and parked behind the vehicle, its lone driver slowly emerged from within. Standing there by the roadside, the officer noticed that the driver's face expressed a nervous demeanor. Tension clung to the hot Florida air as the officer approached. His gut feeling told him that this individual was unlike the regular people he had encountered on his usual patrols. And he was right. This was no ordinary traveller. Through police database checks, the driver was identified as Private First Class Michael Hochstadt, a soldier from the 701st Military Intelligence Brigade. Upon being identified, Michael was arrested immediately, and within days, 5 more of his colleagues were found and taken into custody. They were Vance Davis, Military Intelligence Analyst, Specialist Kenneth Beeson, Sergeant Annette Eccleston, and 2 carrying the rank of Private First Class, Chris Perlock and William Setterberg. But why were they arrested, you may ask? Well, these 6 individuals, once dedicated defenders of their nation, were fugitives. Their status was AWOL, and their desertion from their base in Augsburg, West Germany, had resulted in a global manhunt. The early 1990s marked the end of the Cold War, and during those days, the USSR was facing its imminent collapse, and would eventually do so in 1991. Naturally, the US High Command harboured concerns and speculated that one scenario behind the sudden disappearance of their personnel could have been an abduction by the KGB. As a result, the entire German-based American military was mobilised for the search and rescue mission, yet no sign of the 6 soldiers could be unearthed. They had basically disappeared without a trace. On July 9th, law enforcement agencies worldwide received a cautionary alert, heightening their awareness of the group as they were regarded as potential threats and defectors. It had also been speculated that the 6 of them may have been involved in espionage, and if that really was the case, the gravity of this situation was underscored by the looming possibility of the death penalty. Under this weighty backdrop, law enforcement had to remain extra vigilant, considering that these individuals might resort to extreme measures to evade capture. However, their arrest was calm and no resistance was offered by the group. Interrogations and a 2-week investigation followed. The outcome of this investigation was surprising to many. In what was basically a gentle reprimand, the 6 were honourably discharged with just some minor disciplinary measures, including demotion and the forfeit of half a month's pay. Questions remained. Why had these soldiers chosen this path of defiance? Why were they found in Gulf Breeze, a town which some of you may be aware was once considered to be a UFO hotspot? What had unfolded in Germany to lead them to abandon their posts and take such a risk? And what was the reasoning behind these very lenient discharges? To uncover the motives behind their actions and the events that unfolded, we need to go back to Augsburg, Germany. Field Station Augsburg was the largest of nearly 20 field stations positioned strategically around the world by the United States Armed Forces during the Cold War, and this is where it all began back in November of 1989. What had originally started as something out of curiosity and as a way to pass the time, the group of 6 began exploring their interest in ESP, parapsychology, and tarot cards. Speaking to the Tampa Bay Times in July 1992, Vance Davis, who had become the spokesperson of the group, said, "We decided to do some experimentation. We wanted to see if there was something actually to it. ESP, parapsychology, ghosts, tarot cards." Davis claimed none of these experiments produced any results, but their curiosity-driven experiments would take a dramatic turn when they expanded their experiments and research to include the Ouija board, stating, "Someone showed up. I'm talking spiritually." Over the subsequent months, Vance Davis said that the group made contact with several spirits. The spirits gained the group's trust and confidence by apparently making some successful predictions, which included the 1990 Gulf War, which a skeptical or speculative mind may find easy to dismiss, since leading up to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, there were several signs and warning indicators that suggested Saddam might be considering such an aggressive move. However, more impressive and far less easy to foresee was the devastatingly tragic earthquake that took place in Iran on June 21, 1990, which sadly claimed the lives of at least 45,000 people. It made us wonder why the group didn't try and warn officials in Iran. Wouldn't that have been a great way to convince the world of something otherworldly? Between that November in 1989 and April 1990, the group meticulously documented a series of astonishing predictions conveyed to them by the spirits, and we'll look at those towards the end of the video. These prophecies, totaling 85 in number, were gathered over the course of 8 sessions. In an interview with the TV show Sightings, Vance Davis said,
"All of our predictions were documented. The military confiscated all of our written notes after we were captured 2.5 years ago. So the government knows that our predictions are extremely accurate, but for them to admit that publicly, of course, is a different matter."
In the course of one Ouija board session, the spirits guided the group to establish contact with a woman named Gabrielle, who was based in Munich. The spirits asserted that she held information about UFOs and the presence of aliens on Earth. Remarkably, the group's efforts led them to Gabrielle, who apparently did supply them with the documents related to extraterrestrials. By the end of May, the group were told by the spirits they should get out of the military due to the foreseen significant events that were going to take place in the next 5 years. And as Davis put it, being in the service would not help us grow and become what we were supposed to become. Davis went on to make some pretty crazy sounding claims, saying that the spirits told them that their purpose was to prepare people for the coming chaos. This will be the changing of the earth, and Jesus is involved, he added. Eventually, the mysterious board instructed them to leave, just leave, and reassured them things would work out. And that, of course, is just what they did. The 6 of them gathered their possessions and left Field Station Augsburg. We had top secret clearances and never did anything wrong in our life, Davis continued in the Tampa Bay interview. Being AWOL was the furthest thing from our mind. On July 3rd, 1990, the 6 boarded a flight from Munich to Atlanta and went on to Gulf Breeze, where their arrest would take place. As a quick background into the significance of Gulf Breeze, in November 1987, a contractor named Ed Walters apparently witnessed and photographed a series of UFO sightings in Gulf Breeze which attracted a lot of attention. MUFON, a non-profit organisation of civilian volunteers who study reported UFO sightings, gave him tamper-proof equipment and believed his photos to be genuine. Ed would gain further credibility through polygraph tests and a psychiatric evaluation. Despite the growing number of sightings, media pressure and skeptics emerged and began discrediting the events as hysteria and labelled Walters as a fraud. Nevertheless, more UFO sightings persisted in Gulf Breeze for 3 more years, involving over 200 witnesses. I personally remember seeing Ed's photos over 30 years ago, and I remember being amazed by them. However, looking at those photos today, they seem less impressive, which is a shame as I really want to believe. Anyway, this brings us up to speed, and as you know, the 6 were arrested, but eventually released. The story of the Gulf Breeze 6, as they became known, is a pretty peculiar one, however you look at it. Isn't it strange that 1,400 of the 1,600 pages from the official US Army report still remain classified? Some undoubtedly would think so. But is this to be expected, given the fact that some of the group had top-secret clearances? In 1995, Vance Davis released a book titled Unbroken Promises, a true story of courage and belief. Unfortunately, we were not able to get hold of a copy while researching for this video, but the online reviews seem to all state that it goes over the details we've outlined so far, plus further details about the group's predictions, which we will go over shortly. One of our theories that came up while discussing this case is that the Gulf Breeze 6 simply shared a delusion. It's rare, but it does happen. Otherwise known as a folie à deux, French for madness by 2, it's a disorder characterized by sharing a delusion among 2 or more people in a close relationship. The inducer, who has a psychotic disorder, influences with delusions another non-psychotic individual based on false and surreal beliefs. Stress and social isolation appear to be the 2 main triggers. Could it be possible that on that base in Germany, thousands of miles far from home, that's what these 6 people experienced? Although the exact causes of shared delusional disorder remain unknown, people who are socially isolated together tend to become dependent on each other, leading to an inducer's influence on those around them. Neurology's favourite word is deficit, and in most mental disorders, the sufferer totally loses the emotional, the concrete, the personal, and the real. As British neurologist Oliver Sacks explains in his genius book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, a man can lose himself and cannot know it, because he is no longer there to know it. He's not even fighting. He does not know what is lost. So who is more tragic, or is more damned? The man who knows what is lost, or the man who does not? Can a man be desouled by disease? While it does seem that a shared delusion is a possible explanation for the case of the Gulf Breeze 6, you still have to wonder if there really was more to it than mere delusion. Have you ever heard of the Stargate project? Just briefly, the Stargate project was a classified US government program that aimed to investigate and eventually utilize psychic phenomena for military and intelligence purposes. It was active from the 1970s and through the 1990s. The primary goal of Operation Stargate was to harness the supposed psychic abilities of individuals for espionage and intelligence gathering. The initiative was in response to speculation about the Soviet Union's engagement in psychic phenomena research, prompting the US government's interest in assessing the validity of these reports. Researchers within Operation Stargate concentrated on diverse aspects of psychic phenomena, with a particular emphasis on remote viewing. This practice involved individuals asserting the ability to perceive or collect data about distant or concealed targets using extrasensory perception. So could the collective focus of the members of the Gulf Breeze 6 somehow have triggered a mysterious source of psychic insight, akin to the clandestine experiments of the Stargate project? Driven by curiosity and a shared determination to glimpse into the future, they eventually experimented with the Ouija board and believed that spirits were the source of the predictions. But is it possible that it was not the board itself, but the synergy of their collective intent that held the key to unlocking enigmatic forces? Perhaps it was a mix of both, or neither. Maybe it really was just delusion and coincidence. Given that these predictions were written over 30 years ago, we can go back and see how many of them have come to pass so far. On unbelievablefandom.com, a compilation of the 85 predictions has been listed, so let's take a look. Another earthquake was predicted, this time in Russia. They estimated it would claim the lives of over 1,000. Sadly, this was accurate. An earthquake did indeed take place in 1995 on Sakhalin, a Russian island. In this instance, 1,989 lives were lost. They accurately predicted the reunification of Germany, but like the Gulf War, some may argue that there were enough signs to indicate that this was likely to happen anyway. Prediction number 28 was very interesting. It stated, US stock market will crash. It will rise to over 4,000 before the event. It just so happens that during the dot-com bubble of 1999 to 2000, the Nasdaq 100 index spent 6 glorious weeks above the $4,000 mark before the bubble burst and came crashing down. It has to be said, this was quite an impressive prediction. Some of the more out there predictions include a test on a UFO will result in the destruction of a space shuttle. Special people will emerge around the world to teach truth by 2000. The Aborigines will save Australia before departing this plane of existence. Australia will then become a mecca of sorts for the soul. Greece and Italy will significantly be altered by changes in the ocean's depth. Old sunken cities will be brought up by the same event. Over 30 years later, and with the gift of hindsight, we can all see that none of these more extreme events have taken place yet. But maybe some of these prophecies are yet to come true. Skeptics of this case will say that the correct predictions were obvious, or that the group had inside information. They may also point out the fact that if you make enough predictions, some are bound to come true. And these are fair points. What isn't quite as easy to dismiss is the very strange behaviour exhibited by the 6 individuals involved, the very lenient disciplinary measures taken against them, and of course the 1,400 pages in the official US Army report that remain classified to this very day. What are your thoughts on the case of the Gulf Breeze 6?
It's just not possible, Charles. It's not believable. It's just not possible, Charles. It's not believable. It's not believable. It's not believable. It's not believable.
Just after midnight of June 22nd, 1991, Charles Holden was returning home from his factory job in the American farming town of Harrington, Delaware. Upon slowly approaching his driveway, he noticed a stranger walking suspiciously around his trailer home, which was adjacent to the farmhouse where his mother lived. Panicked, he made the decision to get to the nearest payphone and call the police, rather than choosing to confront the suspicious man himself.
Is anybody out there at your house? My mother is next door to my trailer, and she lives alone. I'd like to get somebody out there as soon as I can, because I don't want to break into my mother's.
When the officer arrived, she and Charles checked his property, but could see no signs of forced entry. The same could not be said for the home of his 70-year-old mother. Upon seeing that the door had been forced open, Charles and the officer entered the house, and when they ascended the stairs, they made a tragic discovery. The lifeless body of his mother bearing the marks of a frenzied attack, with multiple wounds over her face and chest. An intense and crazed attack such as this, often referred to as overkill, is typically associated with cases where the victim has some kind of relationship with their assailant and is often a crime of passion. Initial thoughts of the scene and the body led investigators to believe that she had been the victim of SA, but no evidence of this was found by the medical examiners. Doubts began to creep in, and investigators began to grow a little bit suspicious of Charles. They started to wonder if the crime scene had been staged. Adding to this theory was the fact that no clear motive was present. No valuable items had been taken, including the victim's purse, removing the likelihood that this was a robbery gone wrong. They also began to wonder why Charles hadn't confronted the man himself. At the onset of the investigation, the attending police officer informed them that upon discovering his mother's lifeless body, Charles started uttering repeatedly, "I can't believe he killed her. I can't believe he killed her." He would then go on to tell the investigators that he knew who the suspicious man was, and told them the story of how he came to know the assailant. Charles claimed that after he had finished work at 11 p.m, he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant on his route home, just like he had done so on many nights previous. As he left the restaurant, he was stopped by a man who pleaded with him for a lift to Georgetown, which was a bit further than Charles wanted to drive at that time of night. Reluctantly, Charles agreed to take him part way, but said he would only be able to go as far as the intersection, 3 miles down the road, which is where he would normally turn off to get home. The stranger agreed on the terms and they set off. They eventually reached the intersection and Charles pulled over and told the man he had driven as far as he could, and pointed out a nearby phone booth, telling the man he could call for a ride. The stranger then started to become aggressive and refused to leave. They exchanged firm words with each other for a while, then the stranger suddenly launched an attack and made threats to take his truck. Charles quickly grabbed his keys from the ignition and got out, with the man following him out through the driver's side. He then said the man had taken a screwdriver which he found inside the truck and threatened him with it. The two men scuffled for a brief moment, but neither of the two were injured. The stranger continued to threaten Charles's life if he didn't drive him the entire way, and eventually Charles managed to calm the man down by agreeing to take him wherever he wanted to go. At this point, Charles knew he only had one choice. He had to get away from this crazed man. As they walked towards the truck, The stranger made his way round the back to get to the passenger side. Charles took his chance. He leaped into his truck, started the engine, and made his getaway. He was safe. He sped off into the night, heading in the opposite direction of where his home was, so that the maniac would not be able to follow him in the direction of his home. The ordeal had left Charles shaken. He said to calm his nerves, he drove around for 20 minutes, also hoping that it would definitely throw the stranger off his tracks if he had indeed tried to follow him. After roughly 30 minutes had passed, Charles started to make his way home, keeping an eye out for the man. He drove slowly, turned down side roads, and kept a watchful eye. But after not seeing the man, he made his way back. However, fate would take an unbelievable turn. As chance would have it, as he was approaching his driveway, he spotted that same man walking past his trailer. Shocked and surprised, it was at this point he decided to make that call to the police. Charles made the claim that the man he had picked up somehow found his home and took revenge. However, police did not buy this story, and realistically, you can see why they would think it to be so unbelievable. First of all, how on earth did the hitchhiker know where Charles and his mother lived? They also had a lot of neighbours, so out of all the other houses, this suspicious man not only had to walk what was apparently at least half a mile down the road, he also needed to make a turn down the correct street and continue for a while to reach the correct house, then go into that house and take the life of the person laying in bed. Would you believe that story? The investigation even discovered that there was a possible financial motive for Charles. His mother had an accidental death insurance policy, with Charles named as the beneficiary, and making matters even more incriminating, Charles did have financial problems, and this money would allow him to clear his debts. And if it couldn't get any worse, Charles refused to take a lie detector test. Did he have something to hide? Maybe he didn't commit the act himself, but maybe he was involved. Either way, refusal of the polygraph would surely increase suspicion, wouldn't it? Early into the crime scene investigation, evidence was discovered. Evidence that only could have been left by the perpetrator. On the stairway banister of the farmhouse, a bloody palm print was left behind. The investigators confronted Charles with this and demanded he give his own prints for comparison. The results came in. It was not a match. Finally, Charles was off the hook, for now at least, but the authorities were still suspicious that he had some form of involvement. Detectives returned to the location where Charles said he met the hitchhiker and managed to find people who were also there that night. The people they questioned did back up Charles's story of the man looking to hitch a lift, and their descriptions of him matched. This prompted police to create this composite sketch, and from that they were able to match potential suspects from their database who shared a likeness to men in a photo lineup. One particular man was picked out by Charles and people from the restaurant, but it would turn out that this suspect not only had a credible alibi, but also his palm print was not a match. Another important clue was later uncovered at the scene of the crime, this time in the form of blood, which was found on the light switch of the victim's living room, and it was proved yet again not to belong to Charles, nor the victim herself, and could only belong to the killer, who must have cut his hand during the break-in. Despite his constant denials and no supporting hard evidence, suspicions still followed Charles, and considering the story was pretty unbelievable, it's understandable to see why. If he was indeed telling the truth and had absolutely no involvement, we can only imagine his constant regret for showing kindness to this stranger and his reluctance to confront the man when he saw him that second time, but it's unclear if the crime had been committed by then. The case would turn cold for 10 long years, until the Delaware Police Department were able to gain access to the National DNA Database of criminal offenders. Finally, they made a breakthrough. A match was made. The DNA belonged to a career criminal named Gilbert Cannon. The composite was an accurate resemblance, and it was proven that he was living in Delaware at the time of the murder. Police eventually located him, living just 40 miles away from where the crime took place, and they brought him in for questioning. Initially, he denied any involvement, but after being confronted with the irrefutable DNA evidence, he caved and admitted his guilt and agreed to recall the events of that night. After Charles had escaped Gilbert, who claimed to have been high on coke, he said that he had no choice other than to continue walking in the direction of the houses he could see to try and find a house that looked empty in order to break in and find somewhere to sleep. Every house he passed all had their lights on, so he kept walking and walking until he finally found a house that looked like it might be empty, so he decided to break in through the back door, which unfortunately woke the homeowner. In fear of being identified, the career criminal panicked and stabbed Charles's mother to death in his drug-fueled craze. When the investigating officers told Gilbert who his victim was, he was completely surprised and totally unaware of the connection between her and Charles. It truly was just a coincidence. Sadly for Charles, the saying ran true: no good deed goes unpunished. Gilbert finally faced justice and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. After enduring a decade tarnished with constant suspicion from authorities, neighbours, and even certain family members, Charles had at last emerged completely exonerated. Nonetheless, he will forever harbour a sense of guilt, his conscience weighed down by his role in that intricate interplay of random events and their tragic climax. If only he'd just declined to give the stranger a ride that night, his mother would still be alive today. A poignant reminder that, as the adage suggests, virtuous actions can sometimes bear unintended burdens. It's also crazy to think that if Gilbert had just kept out of trouble, he may well have gotten away with murder. Thankfully, there is closure in this dark symphony of chance and consequence. On the grim dawn of July 11th, 1996, a man's lifeless body was found in a car park of an under-construction hotel in Knoxville, Tennessee. The dead man was unclothed from waist down and had been brutally beaten. While dealing with the discovery of the deceased is an everyday occurrence in the life of homicide investigators, this crime scene would prove to be far less ordinary. It would reveal itself to be a puzzle with a few peculiar pieces, both missing and present. The first of these pieces was noticed straight away. Littered around his body were banknotes from Germany, Canada, and the US, amounting to almost $4,000. Also recovered was a Toyota car key and a traveller's pouch containing other valuables, including gold and platinum. The man's wallet also remained at the scene, and the ID inside revealed him to be Blair Adams, a 31-year-old resident of Surrey, British Columbia, Western Canada. According to the Toronto Sun, the autopsy determined that the Canadian had been fatally beaten and succumbed to septic shock resulting from a ruptured stomach. Possible evidence of self-defense wounds were also apparent, but investigators were only able to find one single piece of forensic evidence: a lengthy strand of hair tightly gripped within his hand. Was this a sign he fought back? It is noteworthy that Adams bore numerous cuts and abrasions, notably a severe wound on his forehead, attributed to either a crowbar or a club. However, the investigation failed to recover a potential murder weapon at the scene. The fact he was undressed from waist down led to the theory of Blair Adams being a possible victim of SA, but no DNA evidence substantiated this idea. Given the absence of any witnesses, the closest testimony came from a security guard working at another nearby site, who reported hearing a scream around 3:30 AM, although he described the sound to be more like a woman's scream, perhaps the source of the long strand of hair. Lieutenant Jim Jones was the chief of detectives for the Knox County Sheriff's Department when Blair's body was discovered. Jones commented on that ghastly crime scene.
His pants were removed in a way not like someone would take their own pants off, but in a way that someone else would remove your pants from you in a pulling motion where his pants were turned inside out.
Who was Blair Adams, and what led him to this fate? Born on December 28, 1964, and residing in Surrey, British Columbia, Blair worked as a foreman at his stepfather's construction firm. In 1995, he had returned from Germany, where they'd been working on a building project. His girlfriend at the time portrayed him as well-mannered, while a co-worker in Germany described him as rude and quarrelsome. Adams had battled alcoholism in the past, but had been sober for 2 years. However, by the summer of 1996, he stopped attending his Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and apparently began showing unusual behaviour, differing from his typical demeanour. Was there something troubling him? Something more than the usual troubles any of us face? And if so, what? According to his mother, Sandra Edwards, Blair began having wild mood swings. When she described her son's behaviour prior to his disappearance, she revealed,
"He hadn't been sleeping well. Something was wrong. I asked him numerous times what was wrong, and he said, 'Oh, I don't think I should tell you about it.' And to this day, I don't know what it is."
It was said that Blair had become absent-minded. On a few occasions, he left his construction worksite unlocked. The sudden onset of absent-mindedness could certainly be an indication of deeper-rooted problems. But it also made us wonder if there was actually a reason he left the site unlocked. Was he letting someone in, for example? Also, was there a connection with his employment in construction and the fact that his body was found at a construction site? Or was this just a coincidence? Blair revealed to his German girlfriend concerns about potential threats from former colleagues who had recently returned from Germany, and by early July 1996, he became totally paranoid and strongly believed that someone was plotting to kill him. From this moment onwards, his plan for his great escape to the United States kicked off. On July 5th, Adams withdrew nearly all the funds from his bank account and emptied his safety deposit box containing more than $6,000 cash, along with jewellery, gold and platinum. Blair's great escape from a perceived danger was not as easy as he'd hoped for, and he faced a series of frustrating obstacles. In the early hours of July 7th, Adams made his first attempt to cross the border from Canada into the US by trying to board a ferry in his Chevrolet Chevette from Victoria to Seattle. However, he faced rejection from immigration authorities. His noticeably anxious behaviour, coupled with the large amounts of cash and valuable items he was carrying, made them suspect he was a drug trafficker, and a subsequent background check uncovered that he had a criminal record related to drugs and a minor violent offence. Not long after this rejection, on July 8th, Blair quit his job, much to the surprise of his stepfather and employer. Shortly after, Adams spent somewhere in the region of $2,000 in cash on a return flight to Frankfurt, Germany. The flight was due to leave the following day. In the very early hours of July 9th, Adams made another desperate attempt to enter the US by showing up at a friend's house just before 1 a.m. In a panic, he tried to convince her to drive him over the border, saying that someone was after him. However, she could not do anything to help him, given the time and not being able to leave her children at home on their own. Later during that same morning, he attempted to cross the border on foot, but officials spotted him and picked him up. During his detention, they noticed the would-be border hopper had small scratches on his hands and legs. He also happened to match the description of a suspected car thief, and the blue vehicle that had been stolen from Vancouver was parked near the area Blair was attempting to cross. He appeared dazed and professed his innocence, and since the Pacific Highway Border Authorities had no evidence to hold him, he was released back into Canada, reported the Knoxville News-Sentinel. Later that same day, Blair went to Vancouver Airport, but instead of boarding the plane to Frankfurt, he requested a refund for his ticket, claiming that the person he was going to visit had fallen ill. While at the airport, Blair then rented a white Nissan Altima and made his way back to the border. On his third attempt to cross, he successfully managed to enter the US. He then drove to Seattle Airport and took a one-way flight to Washington, D.C. After arriving in Washington early Wednesday morning of July 10th, he rented a Toyota Camry and was on the road by 6:45 a.m., making a 7-hour drive to Knoxville, where he was first seen at Strawberry Plains Pikes petrol station around 5:30 p.m., where more strange behaviour was noticed. This was because Blair could not get his car to start. Gerald Sapp, a driver from an interstate repair service company, was called to assist. As it turns out, Blair was using the wrong key. It was from the Nissan he had rented previously. However, he strangely refused to admit his mistake, and insisted he had been using the key previously. Was he really just confused here? By this point, it's starting to become clearer that it really does seem he was going through some kind of breakdown or episode. Some reports claim that he refused to check his pockets for the other key, whereas others say he checked his pockets but there was no sign of the Toyota keys. However, one thing is for sure, those keys were located again, at the crime scene. By that time, the rental car company had already closed for the day, so his car was towed and Blair found himself stranded in Knoxville until the following morning. The staff at the hotel described him as anxious, as if he was expecting someone to walk in, though there was nobody there. The hotel's surveillance footage also revealed that within 1 hour, Blair entered and exited the lobby 5 times before eventually paying $100 cash for the room and then leaving without taking his change. After checking in, Blair placed the room key in his pocket, but instead of going to his room, he walked out the front entrance and never returned. Blair Adams was last seen alive at 7:37 p.m. on July 10th. 12 hours later, his body was found. Blair's odd unexplained road trip through the US from British Columbia all the way to Tennessee seems just as confusing as the circumstances surrounding his death. Every aspect is an unexplained mystery, but there are many theories, each one though with a flaw of some kind. The Knoxville police first suspected that Blair's murder was a robbery gone wrong. However, that had to be ruled out as none of his money or valuables were stolen. They also looked into the possibility that it could have been a drug-related crime. However, again, no evidence was found to support that theory either. A nearby truck stop was the known hotspot for women offering certain illicit services, so investigators looked into the possibility that Blair may have been killed by one of these adult workers or her handler, but again, no evidence was found. It's also unlikely that such attackers would leave all the valuables behind. On the night before the fatal crime, Blair was apparently seen with an unidentified man outside a Cracker Barrel restaurant near the Fairfield Inn he was meant to be staying at. A composite sketch was made of the man. However, investigators never identified the man and never found out any further connections between him and Blair Adams, or his murder. When Adams worked on a construction project in Frankfurt, He dated a German woman who was supposedly the girlfriend he was going to visit when he purchased the flight tickets to Frankfurt. However, the German woman later revealed that he had never gotten in touch with her about his upcoming visit, but this could just mean he was planning on showing up unannounced. When you break down Blair's movements in the days prior to his death, it appears erratic and without logic. It would be practically impossible for someone to follow him all the way from British Columbia to Seattle, to Washington, and then to Knoxville, keeping in mind this all happened pre-social media. Perhaps he only stopped in Knoxville because he happened to pull over for gas there, and lost, or thought he lost, his rental car keys, as there seems to be no significant connection between him and that city. Perry Moyers, a detective for the Knox County Sheriff's Department, was one of the many baffled investigators working on the case. Moyers commented,
I mean, why go to D.C. to turn around to come back to Knoxville? He had no business or no reason to be in East Tennessee. He had no business or no reason being in Knoxville. Everything we can find out, he knows no one in East Tennessee or the eastern United States.
The strange death of Blair Adams and his nonsensical journey still persists many years after his passing. It is most likely that Blair Adams experienced a psychotic episode, and then his path crossed with the wrong kind of person at this unfortunate time. But could he really have been running away from someone? Did someone really want to hurt him? Or was he just a victim of his own delusion? In our exploration of Blair Adams' perplexing case, we came across a poignant post on Reddit that detailed a user's intriguing personal experience, which shaped their own theory about Blair's eventual fate. The post, now 4 years old as of the time of writing, originated from a since deactivated account. The user, self-proclaimed as no expert, shared their own family's struggle with severe mental illness, drawing parallels to an incident in 1999 involving their brother. There was an occasion where their brother's distorted view of reality led to the belief that a barcode on a can of drink was communicating with him. Quote, telling him to drive to Maine because someone was trying to kill him. And that's exactly what he did. As he's driving, he starts reading license plates. They are telling him to drive to the border of Canada, then Albany, then Jersey. Long story short, the poor guy ended up in a jail cell in goddamn Oklahoma. He had a substantial amount of cash on him, plane tickets, train tickets, and some of my grandfather's jewellery. When the police asked the user's brother why he was carrying the valuables, the first answer he gave was that he didn't want anyone to steal it. The second, however, was that he was on the run from the CIA, who were trying to kill him. Very similar motives behind the irrational movements of Blair Adams. So was he suffering from adult-onset schizophrenia, as the Redditor suggests? While something like this would explain the movements of Blair Adams across the United States, how was his life taken, and why? Is it possible he was at the construction site through confusion? Given that he worked on many sites, did he momentarily think he was somewhere he wasn't? Maybe he was dragged out of a car or truck, maybe while laying down across a back seat on his front, being pulled by his ankles, though I'm not sure how or why he would be in a car. Did someone then stomp on his stomach after hitting him in the head? Then perhaps they kicked his pouch and left the scene. The kick then explaining why the money was scattered everywhere. And what about the woman screaming that the security guard heard? Perhaps this was one of the previously mentioned ladies of the night, or even an innocent woman that Blair accosted. Would that explain the long strand of hair found in his hand? Could Blair have been the perpetrator that night and paid for it with his life? During the process of making this video, a thought crossed my mind. Did Blair accidentally bring this on himself? The concept of manifestation is something I've heard of, but admittedly don't know much about. The idea is that you use the power of imagination and the mind to attract things into your life. You put out a certain frequency and attract like frequencies. It's definitely considered pseudoscience by the mainstream, but there do seem to be some pretty convincing stories out there. So if Blair really was suffering from severe delusions, constantly living in that frequency of fear and paranoia, did he attract that unfortunate fate that befell him, despite not actually being in trouble in the first place? Even our own theories and ideas are full of missing pieces. What do you make of this curious case?